This is a great way to start a webinar with, in the chat box, greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Looking forward to this conversation. Wow. So welcome to you from South Africa. Hi, I'm Rosalie Harden, and I'm the founder of Faith and Finance, Reimagining God's Economy. And I am so excited to be welcoming you to our third webinar. Our first two webinars were also very exciting, a conversation between Edgar Villanueva and Jed Emerson. Jed, who wrote Purpose of Capital, and Edgar, who wrote Decolonizing Wealth. And then our second webinar with Eve Poole, who has written several books. The most recent one, Buying God, which is a book that we're going to start a book club on shortly. So I want to tell you about our book clubs. In the next week, you will be getting an email from us to invite you to be a part of a conversation with others about Eve's book, Buying God, or either of the other books, Decolonizing Wealth and The Purpose of Capital. And all three of those authors have agreed to visit with the book club members at the end of their reading the book together. So we're very excited to be doing that. The other thing I want to tell you about before we get to the main event today is that our next two webinars, we don't have the dates and times for them, but the first one will be in about a week, and the second one will follow on it. And the topics of those are going to be Christian social entrepreneurs who are working with COVID and how their businesses had to pivot or shift because of what's happening with the pandemic in this country. And the other one is going to be a conversation about reparations and Jubilee and how those two things might be the same or different. And if you have ideas about people you'd like to hear from on either of those topics or any other topic, feel free to email us at info@faithfinance.net, and we'll be so excited to hear from you. And we're looking for ways to engage this conversation about how to bring about God's reign on earth, especially related to economic justice. So today, here to talk about that on a very local and very specific conversation are four people that I want to welcome to the screen with me right now and introduce them briefly. Each one of them will be telling a bit of their story, so I'm not going to do too much introducing of them right now, but just a highlight about who each one of them is. Many of you are here because you've heard that David Robinson, formerly of the San Antonio Spurs, is with us today. David started while he was playing basketball in San Antonio, a charter school called Carver, I believe, which we'll hear quite a bit about, I hope, today, but also started noticing that the economic situation in the neighborhood where Carver was located was not ideal for producing the kinds of outcomes and lives and relationships that he wanted the children and their families to have in San Antonio. So started Admiral Capital, an investing firm that does impact investing. And his son, David Robinson Jr., joined him at Admiral Capital and has since joined Blueprint Local and is living in the center of San Antonio and working on, maybe he finished his MBA, I'm not sure yet which that is, but he's right in the middle of San Antonio looking at urban development and business and how those two things go hand in hand. And he works with my dear friend Ross Baird, who I believe has been at every single SOCAP and came when he was about 15 years old to his first one, when he was working for Bob Patillo and then launching Village Capital, which is an amazing organization that's done more to put money in local impact social entrepreneurs' hands and to spread the idea of business for good around the globe. But a couple of years ago, started Blueprint Local and is now working in several cities, and I'll let him tell you about that when it's time for him to talk. But right now, I'm going to introduce my friend David Bailey, who is co-hosting this with me and is going to be talking with our panel participants. David's a public theologian and a culture maker who believes that the church should lead by example in effective cross-cultural engagement and practices of reconciliation. He lives in Richmond, Virginia, and he is the executive director of Arabon, an organization that builds reconciling communities. And I am so excited, David, to have you here with me today to lead us in this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David, and then we'll hear from each one of you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's a great honor. I would never thought in my life that I'd be interviewing David Robinson Sr., fellow saxophone player. I wasn't as good of a basketball player, but, I definitely had a career in music. And so I always admired that about you. And so, we're here today about faith and finance. And it's really interesting. We're in a time now where there's a lot of pain going on, particularly in the areas of race. One of the things that the work that we do in Arabon is that we help to build reconciling communities, but we focus around the areas of race, class, and culture. And a lot of times people, when we have conversations about race, we think about our relationships with one another, which are important. But race really wasn't like Europeans just woke up and said, hey, I don't like people of African descent. It really had more so to do with the fact that folks had, it was economic reasons. In order to justify taking over lands that didn't belong to somebody else, you had to say these people aren't people. And you had to create laws that enforced that said this was okay. And, if you think about this, we're addressing a problem that was centuries in the making, and we're only decades away from trying to make a corrective pattern. In 1968, which it made it illegal to overtly say that you could discriminate against people's skin color. It took the 1970s before you began to enforce those laws, the federal government enforced those laws. And by the 1980s, we said, hey, we're in a post-racist society, let's be colorblind. But we didn't really address the significant issues. And so one of the things that Rosalie and I have in common is that we definitely believe that racism is a spiritual issue. At Arabon, we say racism is a spiritual principality, manifested economically, legislated politically, and affects us all relationally. And so often we try to address these issues from a relational side, and then maybe oftentimes it falls apart on the political side. But even if we work through the political side, we oftentimes don't get to talk about the economic. And then those who talk about the economics don't also talk about the spiritual. And so what we're trying to do here is bring all these things together. And if you have read anything about David Robinson Sr., you know that he's a man of faith, a man of integrity. Everybody says that about him. It's one of his reputations. And I think I would love to start this interview off just by, I think, David, we know you, and it's like 3 Davids on here, so I'm gonna try to say David Sr. so we know who we're talking to. David Sr., we know that you're in a place where, we know you as an NBA player, but I think a lot of times when we have these conversations about race, about like institutional injustice, and like economic development, we oftentimes can talk about it historically. We can oftentimes talk about it from a percentage standpoint of data. But the reality of it, this is stories. And I was just thinking about literally when we talk about people like kind of getting out the hood or like trying to climb up the socioeconomic ladder, some of the historic ways that people do that is, number one, go to college. If they don't go to college, they go to the military. If they don't go to college or military, they end up being like an NBA professional.
There you go. I did all that.
Yeah. So I was like, so you're an overachiever. And so
I figured one of them might not work. I got to try them all.
So, man, could you just kind of talk about your family, the great migration? Can you just kind of tell your story, before you became a household name, just kind of tell a little bit of how did you you and your family kind of get to where where did y'all start? How did you get to this point? And then kind of how did that shape your work that you're doing now?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's logged in, everybody who wants to hear this conversation, because I think this is the first step in us actually making some progress, right? Actually talking and understanding one another. You know, I see a lot of angry people, and I also see a lot of people who don't understand why everybody's so angry. So this is really good having this conversation. And, you know, I've been kind of in the trenches here in the education space for a long time, and I see the disparities. I was actually motivated to get into the education space because of the disparities. My grandfather my grandfather was from Little Rock, Arkansas. So my father grew up as a child there in the 50s and was actually one of the ones they asked to be a part of the Little Rock Nine.
Mm-hmm.
And he was going to Horace Mann at the time, all black school. And he said, no way do I want to go through that. I know what those guys are going to have to deal with. I don't want to do it. Right. And so
seemed like a wise man.
Yeah, you know, everybody knows the story. You know, only one of those kids ended up graduating. Right. You know, some of those kids got acid thrown on them. And, you know, in 1958, the governor came in and said, look, this was a mistake. We don't want, you know, our schools integrated. And so, I mean, it was a whole thing, right? It's part of our nation's history that we like to gloss over, right? But it's who we are, right? You know, we got to face up to it. We got to decide, look, all like you said earlier, all these communities are this way for a reason. We've designed them this way. You know, we came into town, you know, in the case of San Antonio, we said, hey, let's build a highway to separate north from south, east from west. And let's make sure commerce doesn't go across that highway, right? Yes. And so in every city we live in, you can go and you can look where the dividing lines are. And you can say on that side of that dividing line, where the minorities are, those kids are going to go to college at a 10% rate. I mean, all these statistics are even across the board. I don't care what city you go into, what state you go into, it happens in every city. So 10% of these kids are going to go to college. 77% of the kids on the other side of the highway are going to go to college. And that's, so you're talking about years and years and years and years of this compounding. Yeah. And then you talk about what's going to be the impact of these kids on the left side of the highway. Oh, they're going to cost society $150,000 each in their lifetime. Yeah. But what about the kids on the other side? Like, oh, they're going to contribute $200,000 per child in their lifetime. Yeah. Wow. These kids over here are going to live 10 years longer than these kids over here. Like, these are statistics that are like, okay, so after all of these years, all of this stuff adds up. And so now we have a society that, you know, San Antonio, I think, is economically the number one most racially segregated city in the country. Yeah. You know, and so that's what happens. The economy just gets so split. Yeah. And people get desperate. You know, you see some neighborhoods where people are fighting over $1, and then you go to Wall Street, people are fighting over the $1 million.
Right.
And so you can understand people's behaviors and people's frustration. And so, you know, so I give my mom and dad a tremendous amount of credit. My mom grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, lived right next to a really nice white high school, but they shipped her out of town to the black high school. And so they knew they were not getting the education. They knew they didn't have as good of teachers and as good of facilities and all that kind of stuff. And so when we were born, my mom and dad said, we didn't get that opportunity. So we want to make sure you guys go to college. So it was ingrained in me that I was going to college. So my brother, my sister, and me there was never a doubt. And I remember going back to Little Rock and seeing all my cousins, and I'd be talking about academics, and I'd be talking about, and they'd be like, man, get out of our face with that stuff. I would think to myself, what's wrong with you? Right, why don't you want to go to college? Why would you make the decisions you're making, selling drugs or doing this or doing that? And it didn't make sense to me because my mom and dad had kind of taken me down a different path. Right. But I saw the impact of those neighborhoods. Yeah. My cousins, beautiful girls, smart, talented girls, but, you know, didn't always make the best life choices given the environment. And so
and we're all products of our environment, right? Exactly. Like, I mean, no matter what environment you're in, a lot of times these decisions were made, like 2 out of 3 decisions, like you were born with certain things you didn't make a decision about, the environment that you grew up in, you didn't make a decision about, but the choice that you made based off of what you were given are choices that you made, but sometimes we're just given different decisions. And even like, to your point, some people get, they get their high school recruiter are the military, and then other folks the high school recruiter are some of the best colleges.
Yeah,
but
Harvard and Yale come and talk to me.
Right. Right. So keep on going.
Yeah, no. So so I'm just trying to give you a little bit of background on kind of what has driven me from a faith standpoint, from a finance standpoint, from a career standpoint. So I grew up going to Little Rock, Arkansas. I grew up going to Columbia, South Carolina every year and seeing this disparity. And so I was fortunate enough to grow up not with a limitation. My parents didn't limit me. They didn't, I thought I could go anywhere.
Yeah.
But I do remember getting to the Naval Academy. My first day at the academy, I laid down on my bed and cried that night because I thought, I don't belong here. These guys are much smarter than me. I mean, I remember them yelling at me all day and all, it's military. So they're always yelling at you. They're telling you, you don't belong here, Mr. Robinson. You're a recruited athlete. You don't belong here, blah, blah, blah. Which, I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. Right. But in my mind, it kind of rang true. Yeah. I really didn't belong there. And, here we are 25 years later now, and I'm a distinguished graduate. But the mindset changed. Yeah. And so, that's why I've gotten in the education space, because I feel like, we've got to equip young kids with the mentality that they belong, that they can make it happen, that they're prepared for any given situation. And I think even as a church, we don't do a very good job of that sometimes, right? Yeah. We get caught up in our own little, a lot of people talk about church and say, hey, that's the most racially segregated day of the week. Everybody runs into their own little buildings. Yeah. And that's, unfortunately, that plays itself out in our society, depending on where you live. I'm here in South Texas. So there are a lot of neighborhoods that are all white. Yeah. And, they might be really nice people, but then when you come around, they act a little bit differently. My kids went to an all-white Christian school. And so I can't count the number of times I went to the front office and I said, look, we're dealing with this, or this attitude, or this is happening. And, and not that they were bad people, they just had no clue what they were saying, whether they were saying something mean to my son or not including him in something, or kind of sticking him out as an example. I remember one time specifically about my middle son came home and said, we had a debate today. Obama at the time was, running for president. And he said, nobody in the class, he's in middle school. Nobody in the class would speak up for Obama. So I decided I would be the guy who would speak up for him. So but he didn't know anything about politics. So he said, I think Obama should be the next president. They said, why? And he said, because he's black. And then the whole class just ripped into my son. And they said, you can't vote for him because he's black. That's wrong. You can't do that. And he, he's trying to defend himself, but he's like the only kid standing against the sea of white kids saying, you can't vote for a guy because he's black. And he's like, why not? Like, he looks like me. I think that's cool. And so, it's that kind of, what we talk about systemic racism that's built in, that it's a discussion I'm so glad we're finally having, because, every so often we have these incidents that happen and we kind of gloss over them like, oh yeah, that was really sad that guy got killed, or that was really sad that, in those neighborhoods that they're not getting good education, or they're not getting this. So, this is a real conversation, right? In a marriage, you wouldn't tell your wife, oh, I'm sorry I did all those things to you, but let's just move on.
I know that's right.
Right? Like, that doesn't go over well with your wife. So why would it go over well in this situation where we have a country that says, okay, yeah, we did a lot of bad things. We actually developed a system to make sure that you stay in neighborhoods. We developed a system to make sure you couldn't get loans to buy houses, because we know that's the way you grow wealth. We developed a system to make sure that you can't get the educational opportunities, because we know that's how you move forward. And so now here we are hundreds of years later, and that impact, that effect is still dogging us, right? It's still a part of our society. So it's so nice to finally sit down and talk and say, you're right. It's a problem. Let's, and now it's affecting all of us, right? We need to do better. We're wasting one of our greatest resources is our children. Yeah. And a big chunk of our children are not getting educated very well. So
could you share like a little bit about that? Because I love, it's Carver, from George Washington Carver, right?
Yeah, Carver.
Of which
Carver
I kind of feel like, just from what I've read about it, and just kind of like it's even in the spirit of Booker T. Washington, right? Like, building Tuskegee, building a community, and it seemed like a thing that you want to do together. But like, how did you evolve from seeing as education as the thing that you wanted to focus on to moving towards like economic development of real estate in the neighborhood?
Well, they go hand in hand, right? Like the opportunities follow the education, right? So they have to see successful people that actually look like them, because if they don't believe it's possible. And you finally see a black president who's well-spoken and really intelligent and does a nice job, and it's kind of cool to see that, right? Like regardless of where you are politically, it's great to see that there's a guy that actually looked like me that was in a position of authority, of power. So I think for these kids, it was important for me to show them from a philanthropic standpoint what it looks like supporting your community. Yes. Did I make a lot of money? Absolutely. But you know what? I put a whole lot of that money back into my community because that was important. Right? I don't just forget where I came from. I say, look, I see the problems. In 27 years now, we've been working on education. We've been addressing the issues and saying, let's try to, lower this divide a little bit. And so, from a business standpoint, for the younger NBA players to be able to say, hey, look, I made the transition. Don't be afraid to find the right people and make the transition to business, because it's important. If you have wealth, the way you keep it is to actually be smart about it and learn about business.
And I agree. And I think, I never heard him say this, or I never read anything, but I just could imagine people talk about what LeBron James did up in Canton. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you had to influence that, and just, being a NBA player that says hey, I want to focus in on education and then think about the context in which it's in. And so now you've kind of not only, I think there's NBA players that you've influenced, but you've also influenced your son. And I want to just transition a little bit to David Jr. and just David, so, can you tell me a little bit about Blueprint? And you said something that when we were kind of preparing for this conversation that I thought was very, very great. You said that investing into schools is investing, you're investing in children, so you're investing for the people for tomorrow. But when you do economic development, you're investing to the people who are here today. And I just thought that was just a significant, an and both type of approach. So can you tell me a little bit about Blueprint? And even before you get into Blueprint, why did you feel like this was a thing you wanted to get into?
Yeah, actually, SoCap was a pretty big journey and big piece of my journey. So I, grew up here in San Antonio. My dad started Carver Academy on the east side. I was always too old to go there, but both my younger brothers went there. So I ended up spending a lot of time in the neighborhood, seeing how that neighborhood has changed over the last 30 years. When in 2000, when we built the school, and that was probably the first new construction in that neighborhood in 30 years. And so now you see, housing prices have, quadrupled in that neighborhood, and you're starting to see real projects happen. Velocity, Texas is redeveloping Merchant Ice Building, and real things are changing. It's taken 30 years, but it's interesting to see where a school, how that philanthropic, investment really had just waves across and made people start to believe in it. Same thing with, Pearl Brewery. It wasn't fully philanthropic, but it was, the level of risk that they took going in there, it was pretty radical. And it takes time, but then you see great fruits from that. And so after that, I went to UT Austin, started really getting into the tech world, and I worked in startups for a few years and got to learn the business side, there, and worked for education technology company, a sports technology company. But then really started getting into finance, really starting to, living in New York City, real estate is just everywhere and on top of you. And it's really started to realize just the nature of real estate. And so Admiral Capital is based there. My dad's business partner's there. And I started working with them and starting to learn the business. Admiral really started with a, very much kind of how Ross and he'll get here, but kind of two-pocket mentality where, mainly doing value-add real estate, but then looking to have sustainable philanthropic funding for a lot of the communities that we want to influence.
Basically tithing into the community.
Yeah.
Okay. That's cool.
And so, but I had really been interested in, what is this impact investing space? And I think a big influence was the Ford Foundation, really publicly stating that they're going to be investing their endowments, in financial inclusion and affordable housing. It's like, wow, that's radical. It's not just the 5% that you're giving away. You're investing, your corpus into change. And so that got me. Oh, yeah.
Pause time, because I think that's a really important thing, right? That I think a lot of times folks are thinking about the 5%, like when you do the endowment, and they oftentimes aren't thinking about the 95% of what they're investing into, and sometimes that 95% could actually be causing damage in society,
absolutely.
right? But you really could invest that 95% and make money in the process and do good, and I think that's something that's kind of newer to the conversation, but I didn't know that was what y'all were doing, but I definitely think that's something that we should note and put a Post-it note on.
Yeah, that was kind of, I think the Gates Foundation, really understanding, if you have, and this is not right numbers, but if you have $100 million foundation, only $5 million of that is actually going to your cause. So you got $95 million just making money. And what if that's making money at the expense of your cause? And so just being thoughtful about that that really started getting my kind of wheels turning. And so, since with Admiral, really started exploring education technology in different areas, but really kind of workforce and affordable housing was kind of the most natural place for us to get involved in on the impact side. And since Value Add is a similar business, we're targeting similar assets, and so I started to learn about kind of, okay, where is our patient sources of capital, and started learning about Community Reinvestment Act, and that goes directly to redlining and getting into these systemic issues, and then regulatory solutions to some of these issues to try and attract public private capital to address public goods. And so really got into CRA and low-income housing tax credits and understanding that space. And this is like right around 2017. And then everybody that I knew in kind of the CDFI world was like, this tax reform is actually going to be, it could wipe out LIHTC. And so I was paying a lot of attention to that. And out of that bill came opportunity zones. And so that just rocked my world. It's long-term capital in low-income communities. How do we get a part, and I just really started thinking, how do we become and be a part of this? And so for the next year, just talk to anybody and everybody that I could about it. And not very many people knew a lot about it. But through that process, I met Ross, and he was in town. We got kind of connected through a mutual friend and mentor, and he was in town, and we started talking, and he had really told me a lot about his background and what he had done at Village Capital. I heard a lot about that work, and really this idea of what became Blueprint, and really place-based investing, local investing in neighborhoods and geographies rather than being so focused on asset classes, and using this OZ capital to be more long-term and more long-term minded. And then also along that time, I started to kind of rebuild a lot of the relationships in San Antonio, which was kind of very timely. And so got to just, people like Lorenzo Gomez, and what he's doing at Geekdom, and, Silver Ventures at the Pearl, and just all these amazing things that kind of redefined how I thought about San Antonio. Because growing up here, my first instinct was to get out. I wanted to
get out.
I was like, I gotta go
somewhere, get an
I gotta
opportunity.
go see things. And so I went to Austin, I went to New York. But I was kind of really learning about San Antonio and kind of relearning about the city. And so when we, and then Ross and I kind of worked on, what was becoming Blueprint for a few months. And in the beginning of 2019, we actually launched it. And so I moved back to San Antonio, and we launched the firm, and it's been a journey from there.
That's really great. That's good. I feel like that's a good segue. Thanks so much for just sharing y'all's story and kind of how y'all got to this point. And it'd be good to bring in Ross Baird, who's y'all's partner in this conversation. And we're going to have some Q&A in a little while. And so, Ross, can you just share a little bit about, like, let's start off, what is an opportunity zone? And then you say blueprint local. So I'm assuming with the term blueprint that there is a way to be able to use this model not only in San Antonio, but y'all are actually in Richmond, and you're going to be doing some work in Richmond and other parts around the country. So can you share a little bit about opportunity zones and blueprint local?
Sure. And David and David and David, the three of you are a tough act to follow. I hope to equip myself well in the non-David bracket, but I can't touch any of the Davids, so I'll do my best. My name is Ross Baird, and it's great to be here. As Rosalie said at the beginning, I was at the very first SOCAP, which was right after the 2008 financial crisis, and it was, a couple hundred weird people talking about how to blend faith and finance and money and meaning. And here we are, 12 years later, and a lot has changed. We couldn't have considered that 200 people would be talking about this on a Friday afternoon 12 years ago. But a lot hasn't changed. The inequities that were concerning in the last financial crisis have only gotten worse in a lot of neighborhoods, and it's been a bit of a journey. So how I got here, I was in the early days of launching an organization called Village Capital, which has become one of the most active impact investment firms. And our very first investment in Village Capital was in New Orleans. And I originally got to New Orleans, and this relates to the story of David and San Antonio and Carver. A mentor of mine at the University of Virginia, where I went undergrad, was a strong believer, very strong Christian. She was Catholic, and she had had a close relationship with the nuns of the Order of St. Catherine Drexel, who set up Catholic schools for African Americans, Native Americans all across the country. And she had a very close relationship with a Black Catholic school in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina hit the city. And she created a course when I was an undergrad where we actually did a study abroad in New Orleans right after the hurricane. And we slept in the basement of this gym, and basically there were 3 St. Catherine Drexel Black Catholic schools in New Orleans. 2 got completely washed away. The 3rd was on dry land and was open. And there were kids from these schools. They reconstituted these 3 schools into one, and we worked and put this one school together. And it was one of the only open schools in New Orleans a couple months after the storm. And it was an amazing personal experience as a believer. It was an amazing professional experience. And so I stayed in touch with Sister Eileen, the nun who ran that school. And when we were starting Village Capital, we were looking for entrepreneurs in distressed communities across the country. And less interested in places like New York and San Francisco. And I went back to New Orleans, and I visited Sister Eileen, that nun who still ran the school. And I found there was a pretty amazing community of entrepreneurs. This is now 2009, 4 years after Katrina. The big businesses left New Orleans, but this entrepreneurial community was staying and generating. And so, Village Capital, our first 2 investments, were a local food business and an education technology business in New Orleans. And Village Capital has made over 100 investments with this idea of what investment that is thoughtful and values driven means when that business succeeds. If a business in New Orleans succeeds, it matters a lot more to New Orleans than if a business in San Francisco succeeds matters to San Francisco. So this connection between capital and opportunity and impact in place never really left. Flash forward, in my organization at Village Capital, and a lot of people in the call, I've worked with you in a lot of different contexts. We've invested in over 100 entrepreneurs, and the Village Capital investment model is to put decision-making power in the hands of the entrepreneurs. And a lot of that comes from some philosophical and spiritual reflections around the role of money and power. I mean, if you learn anything, it's having money can corrupt you very quickly. People making decisions over money tend to be very separated from the problem. So we actually had, for example, a group of entrepreneurs in New Orleans decide who we get the first capital in New Orleans. Through that model over a 10-year period, about 40% of Village Capital's portfolio are women. It's about 2% in mainstream venture capital. 30% of Village Capital's portfolio are people of color. It's about 1% in mainstream venture capital. And when you change the way that you invest, you change the values, you change the process, you change the decision making, you do get different outcomes. That was one of the big lessons.
Could you pause real quick? I mean,
Yeah.
because I think that's like a really important thing. I mean, like, so, Silicon Valley, you talk about 1 to maybe 3%. But like, what was it that y'all did that was different?
So we did a study. The MacArthur Foundation actually funded a study of this. The decision makers in the average venture capital fund are largely people who look like me. The team looks like me. The people doing the initial diligence looks like me. The people in the investment committee look like me. And people tend to invest in people and things that they know and understand. And so when you've got
it's like an affinity bias that you end up like having like I have an affinity to the Davids because our names are very similar. And then you're saying like
pretty close to Ross. I like your name.
Wait, so you're saying like, hey, culturally, gender, like all these kind of like dynamics, there's an affinity bias operating, and people are making decisions, and then so keep on going.
Yeah, I wrote a whole book about this called The Innovation Blind Spot, but essentially people innovate within the bounds of what they know and understand. So if you don't have a diverse team, if you don't have a team that in some ways reflects the places or the problems that you're trying to solve, you're not going to solve. So we changed the decision makers in the Village Capital model at a national level, got very different outcome. I'm very proud of what the Village Capital team continues to do. But some of those experiences, like with the Catholic school in New Orleans, resonated with me. And so I got very deeply involved in a few communities. I worked closely with a friend named Bryce Butler on a local investment project in Louisville, for instance, about channeling local capital to local real estate and local businesses. And so this idea of local really stuck with me in a bunch of different contexts. And then to your question about opportunity zones, I've been thinking about kind of the seed of what became Blueprint Local for years. And I think, same with David and David, what we're doing now in many ways is related to things they did before we even met. But I live in the DC area. I was involved in the creation with 100 different people in the creation of the Opportunity Zone legislation, which the Cliffs Notes is it gives a large capital gains tax advantage for people to invest in distressed places. So the places where we had been investing in Village Capital, all of a sudden when the Opportunity Zone legislation passes, those neighborhoods like the neighborhood in New Orleans where we ran our incubator, now all of a sudden are way more interesting to people that never would have thought of, downtown San Antonio as a good investment. And so, I don't think I don't think a tax advantage is a reason to do something you wouldn't otherwise do. But me and David Jr. and David Senior and others saw a moment in time where there were a lot more people across the country interested in the neighborhoods where we had already been doing the work in our own way. So we formally created this group called Blueprint Local. And so what we're doing is working with local leaders to back projects. For example, we made an investment in Penn Station in Baltimore, which very similar to David's story of San Antonio. The station North Neighbor in Baltimore is the center of Black arts and culture in the 50s. And then they built the interstate and it cut it off from downtown, and it might as well be a different city. There's redlining, institutional discrimination, highways, all kinds of physical things and things around the flow of money that have made this neighborhood poor over the last 60 years. And you have the Amtrak station in the middle of it, and we've identified a great local partner who has a plan to redevelop it as kind of a lighthouse for a community that was once thriving and would like to be again. So whether it's the projects that we're working on San Antonio or Baltimore or other places across the country, I think another thing is I think we have to be a big lesson that we learn every day is we have to be humble around our own limitations too. I mean, capital is a tool. It can be used for good or for ill. Even if we say, hey, we'd like to do X here, if the community doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. Or if there's not someone on the ground to do the implementation, it doesn't matter if it's the perfect idea in theory, it's not going to work. So I think we are also looking for great local leaders in the neighborhoods that we focus on that we can put capital behind. But this Penn Station project, for instance, had been in the works for 20 years, but it couldn't access capital. And being able to put capital behind things that are already existing is a great outcome.
And I just want to say, I mean, y'all are addressing something that I find to be a very something I see all the time. Either you have people on the local ground that are not connected to capital, or you see people who are very connected to capital but aren't connected to folks who are locally. And by the time they kind of come in and say, hey, we're going to invest some capital, decisions have already been made. And this is something that is challenging. I think about what Spike Lee was asked a question. It says, hey, man, what do you think about the Brooklyn, the gentrification going on in Brooklyn? Being a longtime Brooklyn resident, he was like, man, these white people coming here with the Christopher Columbus syndrome. They change their name.
I found a new land. There was nobody here.
And so I kind of see, I really am really thankful for Blueprint Local. This local is something that really means something, and how y'all are doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I just want to make a comment about that separation of capital, because it is very difficult to get the people with money to connect with those communities.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, if you have money, you've got all your finance guys looking in the high dollar markets, making sure you're getting a certain return and taking a certain level of risk. I'm gonna get my 8%. I don't care what happens to everybody else. So I mean, even you see endowments and other people thinking that way, right? Yeah. And that's why David was such a revelation coming to us. Even with our little endowment at Carver, we had a few $1 million, and we were investing it traditionally. And David said, "Well, wait, hold up. Think about how you're investing that money, and so you can double the impact, not just give away 5% of it a year." But you can also make sure that you're impacting the communities and the education circles that you want to impact. And so I think, we need to rethink how we're, interacting with, our money in our community. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I also just want to say, what's implied, but I really want to name this. I think because of the fact that these are communities that you come from, right? These are like the story that you're talking about of people who some people made good choices, some people made bad choices. You're not talking about somebody on a TV that you don't know about or a news story. Mm-hmm. You're talking about actually family members that you love. Right. And I think this is helpful, because I think you see this with Magic Johnson and the work that he's done in investment, and how he brought Howard Schultz in, and he was like, hey, there's economic opportunity here. You just got to be culturally appropriate, And so I think gentrification, the colonization of gentrification, is not only economic, but it's also cultural. Because what happens is people begin to invest economically, and then they begin to change things culturally to fit their cultural preferences and not work alongside the people that are here. And I think there's ways of doing economic development that doesn't flip the script to be a negative pack of gentrification. Right. So Ross, I just want, and I love to before we do Q&A, Ross, I'd love for you to share a little bit about because this is about faith and we folks myself or Rosa Lee, we might be kind of new in the economic side of it and a little stronger in the faith side. And so it was really good to kind of hear and to learn about this first part. But then I think about people who are engaged, who might be engaged more on the economic side. I love to kind of hear a little bit more on the faith. And then Ross, I want you to segue this with, what's been your faith journey, and how did your church involve you? How did your church shape you to get to this point?
Yeah. I had a great youth pastor growing up. Michael Poulos is his name. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina now. Rosalie needs him. And I grew up in a nice part of Atlanta. And the weekend trips, the summer church trips, our church had a relationship with a church here in Washington, D.C. And we would come to DC for a week in the summer and work in really bad parts of DC through doing ministry that this church did. I think the I would say that there is a through line between those really formative experiences, which really came to me because of my faith and what I understood ministry and faith in action looked like. And I mean, what I do today is directly because what some of those most formative experiences growing up were. And I think that I think that the business world is all about, can I get as much as I can as quickly as I can? I think that the example of Jesus with relation to power, I mean, all these questions around race and money and power, I think Jesus speaks directly to. And I think one of the things that Jesus says that is really, really related to a lot of the things we think about and a lot of the important conversations today is Jesus was in his entire life didn't leave about a 30-mile radius, and that was very intentional. He said, "I am not going to be the Roman emperor." Like, that is not what power is. Power is not accumulating as much as you can.
That's good.
In fact, he sends out the disciples to say, try and model or try and emulate what I have done, and your 30-mile radius, wherever it is I'm sending you. And I would say that no one, and I've seen questions around opportunity zones and gentrification and whatever, like the way that all of us can be truly powerful is not having the biggest fund in the world or the biggest market cap in the world. It's by a series of examples where we try and be successful and faithful, but it's small enough that other people can emulate it. So for example, someone asked a question about, have you seen housing that's truly affordable, 50%, 80% AMI? There is an example in San Antonio where the affordability numbers are fantastic. It's a very complicated public finance, private finance project, but the outcomes, if this project says it, will be the highest impact housing thing we've seen. We were, David Senior and I were in Norfolk, Virginia, where David Senior grew up, and we were talking with the mayor of Norfolk and people there about a similar project they wanted to do, and they were asking how to make the numbers work, and David gave them like a PhD seminar in public finance corporations in about 10 minutes. They're like, man, we wish we met you 5 years ago. But it was a model that was developed in San Antonio that spoke to a very specific problem that this Norfolk, Virginia had been wrestling with. And so, I would say, my faith growing up is a through line to why I'm interested in what I'm doing today, but it also, all these questions of power and money and influence that cover the business world, I think thinking about faith keeps us all very grounded.
That's good, man. And David Jr., Senior, just how is faith shaping the work that, y'all are doing?
Well, I'll start. I think obviously it's the motivation, right? When we started our business, we started Admiral Capital. I told my business partner, he was an alumni of Goldman Sachs, and I said, look, I'm not even interested in starting a business unless we're going to be tithing out of this business, right? We're going to be putting the money right back into the community. And when you're talking finance, that's a tricky thing to say 10% of your money is going back into the community. It's like, the first question everyone asks us everywhere we went is, how are you going to pay your team? Well, our team is going to have a mentality as well that we're going to, this is a part of our business, a part of who we are. And I think we've attracted like-minded people because of that. And so, which is unusual in the finance world. It's like Ross said, how much money can you make and how fast can you make it? That's the way the finance world typically works. But as a Christian coming into the world, I always think about when I was a kid, the one scripture that bothered me before I got saved was, it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God. And I just could never understand that. It scared me to death. And I thought, I don't ever want to be rich. I don't ever want to be in that situation, right?
Right.
And now that I've been in a situation where God has given me a lot of resources and opportunity, I understand it, right? I understand that to get the camel, we were in Jerusalem last year, to get the camel through the eye, to that part of the gate, you got to just strip off all the stuff. He gets on his knees and he scooches through the little gate in the city. Because after hours, they would close the main gate, and in order to get through, you had to strip off all the worldly stuff and get through the gate. And so it's really taught me a lot about, hey, if I'm going to work in this world, I got to strip off all that foolishness. I cannot be loaded down with, I want to be this, or I want to be that, or I hope people perceive me as this, or I want to make as much money as all that stuff's got to be stripped off before I can squeeze through. And so that's kind of how I've tried to approach this with my team. Even in our relationship with Ross and David and Blueprint, the first thing I always ask is, are we doing the right thing? That's the very first question. And then the second part is it viable? Are we going, going to be able to make money for our investors? Because, you're not going to stay in business long if you don't do well by your investors. So there is a balance there that you have to find. And so faith really shapes the way that you approach that and trying to make your business and your venture successful.
Yeah, and I'll say maybe just a different perspective. I mean, in the business world, and especially in finance, things have gotten so delocalized that you don't know the people you're doing business with, and that changes things. And so I think, especially in a lot of the communities that are opportunity zones, talking to gentrification, talking about East Austin or East San Antonio or West Side San Antonio or South Side San Antonio or second, third ward in Houston, they don't have faith in people looking at their community, looking to coming into the communities, and there's a lack of faith. And I think, in the past, in the real past, like, you need to be able to trust the people that you're going to be doing business with and the stakeholders in your community. And, I think in East Austin, a lot of folks, either you've been lied to enough times saying, oh, this is coming, it's coming, it's coming. Or when the people actually do come in, they're not looking out for you. It's a private equity firm out of New York where it's just a portfolio, money. It's extractive. And so, I think that faith needs to go both ways, where you have faith in, the people doing work in your communities. And I think on the social side, people have gotten that right, in a lot of ways, but on the financial side and on the business side, that just, like, for some reason doesn't exist. And so, like, we have to get away from, extractive practices to more, acting like we know each other and acting like there's going to be real, repercussions out of our actions on the business side, because there are, whether we see it or not. Like, somebody's going to be feeling that. And I think with Black Lives Matter and a lot of this, what's happening right now in the world, people are angry. I mean, you look at the economic effects of COVID, certain people are having a field day in the stock market, and then others, can't eat. And so, like, there are real, like, the stock market, like, those are real things, and real people suffer, off of some of these practices, which I just think we have to get to.
I think that's a great point about, business being extractive. That's a big problem, right? That's, we have a society, we've created an environment where you can make a business that is not really creating value or doing it, just siphoning money, right? Like, it's very extractive. And good business, good sustainable business is where both parties walk away with something they feel is of value. And I think that we've moved away from that concept of good business. And so, you have to be very careful now who you're getting into business with.
Yeah, that's so good. I think this would be a good time to bring Rosalie back, because I thank y'all so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I could talk to y'all another 30 minutes, but we don't have that kind of time right now. So I'm gonna get Rosalie in. She's been checking out a lot of these questions, and thank y'all so much. It's been wonderful.
So David Bailey, you don't go away. Jump in whenever. But one question that that really is coming up in our Q&A here that people are sharing questions about, but it has also come up around opportunity zones and the work in the center of the city so many times but especially with COVID, there's just a feeling that there's going to be a land grab. And how is Blueprint Local going to work in a way that keeps this from being the opportunity for rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer? How do we make COVID and this disruption an opportunity to make things more equal and not less?
I can start, and David. I mean, I would say there's what do we do every day, and then what example are we hoping to set? I mean, compared to the size of the economy, we are a blip. So, I don't know that we can solve this problem. We just do the best we can with what we've got. But I think going back to some of the fundamentals of what David Senior said, I think the people that we invest in and their values is kind of first and foremost, and the caliber and quality of people we invest in, and trusting that they will do the right thing. Because, you know, if you're developing or building a building or setting rents or whatever, I mean, there are a million little decisions that need to be made every day, and I think we got to trust values alignment with the people who will do it. I think the second thing is, you know, a lot of how we think about the impact, positive or negative, of what we do. I mean, we've had a number of conversations where it's, you know, X community says we'd like a grocery store, and we talk to the 5 grocers that are there, and they're like, why would we put a grocery store there? We're a really poor neighbor. We don't want to, like, we can't get a grocery store to decide. We're not grocery store deciders. So, you know, I think we can't, there's very limited leverage that we have on what people can and can't decide. But I do think there is collected wisdom in communities. And so one of the things we started to be very intentional about is look at, for example, in Richmond, in the Manchester neighborhood, where we're reviewing a few investments. LISC, the National CDFI, has spent the last 10 years doing a very in-depth community development and organizing plan where they've talked to over 1,000 residents, and they've got a document, they've got a plan where the residents say, here's what they want. So when we're reviewing an investment that we're making, you know, the plan, the residents very clearly want 4 things. So we have in the investment memo, you know, how do each of these requests in the plan speak to this specific project? So I think, you know, on our side, you know, what do we do? Who do we invest in? And how does that align with what is being asked for by the community? If there is a thoughtful process, and if there isn't, that's another story. But
Hey,
you know,
just one thing, Ross. I mean, even I want to say, like, even like LISC and like what's been happening in Richmond, like that was an iterative process.
mm-hmm.
Like, they originally, like, first kind of gave the money out, and the people with college degrees to kind of know how to pay attention to stuff, they were the ones that started the, like, free range bicycle coffee shops, you know, and but then, like, you know, then they started this, like, they realized, hey, we need to kind of work on this. So that's actually very encouraging to me, because I didn't know that story, but I knew from this end. But then when developers come, because you're doing the local thing and y'all are asking for it, here's a list. You know, here's a list of things you could do. So this is, like, practically how we can kind of make some changes. Keep on going, Ross. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, good. No, I'll just say the one thing I would say is, you know, the land grab is going to happen. Like I said, business has kind of been devolving into this, hey, we got to make money, period. And so that's going to happen. And like Ross says, we're a blip on the radar screen with our financial influence in the whole picture. But I will say, if you want your community to grow in the right directions, go out and actively support the businesses you want to see stay around, because there are so many businesses struggling right now. I mean, we, you know, through Admiral Capital, we have properties, and we're going to our tenants and saying, look, we understand it's very difficult to pay leases right now. Let's work out a way that we can, you know, lower your leases and, you know, stretch it out over time so that it's manageable, and so that you can stay in business. And so businesses like that need support, right? They need, you know, us to not kind of get caught up in our own little shells, and make sure we're supporting those businesses. So, you know, the first thing we can do is to really be generous and support the businesses that we want to see stay around. It's a tough time for everybody. As a landlord, it's a tough time for us. We still got to pay servicing on debt, right? So we got to collect some rents. We can't go without collecting rents. And so it's a vicious circle that, you know, you kind of have to keep fighting. And when somebody fails in that circle, the sharks are going to come in and take it. That, you know, that's what's going to happen. And so, you know, we got to figure out ways that we can support one another, and particularly in the communities we don't want to see getting taken over.
Yeah, and I mean, directly to your question about, like, what Blueprint's role in some of this, I mean, a lot of, like we've said, you know, a lot of the finance world is how can you make as much money as quickly as possible. And I think the best thing about opportunity zones is the long-term nature of the capital. And so if you look at in development, you know, most money is kind of 3 to 5 year money, you know, that's out there. And so in a post-COVID world, with the amount of uncertainty, you know, where do you go if you think you need to make money in 3 years on a building? It's not going to be downtown San Antonio. It's not going to be, you know, East Austin or South San Antonio. I mean, all of these neighborhoods, it's a flight to quality. So, that means people go to, back to Atlanta and Nashville and San Francisco and New York, and that's where all the money is going to go when it's scared. And so with opportunity zones and the way we're able to look at different developments, it's like, do I believe that downtown San Antonio is going to be flourishing in 10 years? Yes. In areas that, a lot of the areas like that's capital still needs to flow, and it just needs to be long-term capital. And the way we think about it, being long-term stakeholders in communities, not just trying to, find an attractive buy and then flip it, or, that's not our mentality. It's coming in saying, how can we do something that's going to really make a lasting effect and really provide value in this community, because it's going to be there for 10 years, and we're going to have to sell it after 10 years. So it can't just be, slapping up some quick student housing, It's got to be high quality, and it's got to be lasting. And that's the way we're looking at things.
That's good. So here's a question. This person says, I work in affordable housing, and I'm very wary of opportunity zone actually generating and protecting wealth for people who already have it. Do you have examples of opportunity zone projects that are actually meeting the needs of the poor or extremely poor, or do they mostly meet the needs of the 50 to 80% AMI people?
Well, that's a great question. I think Ross is really able to, but you're right. I mean, a lot of the opportunity zone funds we've seen are just chasing real estate. I mean, a lot of them look unfortunately too much like typical real estate funds. I think one of the great things for us is partnering up with Ross. Ross has been extremely thoughtful about it, saying, he cited the example that he worked on, and that's, thinking organically about how do we do a better job to create communities and community strength, and how do we keep wealth in that community rather than drawing wealth out of that community. And so there's, we actually had a whole week-long seminar in Montana where we went and we brought some of the smartest people in the country to talk about how do we keep wealth in communities. And we had some great ideas, but it's always time between the idea and the implementation of those ideas. Right. Opportunity zones are great legislation, but that doesn't mean some people aren't going to take advantage of it the wrong way. And unfortunately, a lot of people have. But one of the great things with working with Ross is that he's thought through a lot of that stuff, and we're kind of more on the front edge of trying to figure out how to keep some of that money in the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think like from affordability standpoint, if you're going to go below 60, the ways that gets built is either low income housing tax credits or just naturally affordable product that's by age. And so I mean that the one thing we've been talking to a lot of people about, but nobody's been able to figure out how to combine, or nobody that I know of it, how to combine LIHTC with OZ Capital. And that would be a really powerful tool. And I mean, this is the first iteration of this program. I mean, it came out like last year, a year and a half ago. So we're all on the bleeding edge of this. And I think it's gotten a lot more capital interested. It needs to get better. It is not a silver bullet. But we're all trying to figure out how to get deeper into affordability. But no, I mean, most of what we're able to target with the capital that we have is in that kind of, that workforce housing range, because it's what's viable to build.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Ross.
I would agree with everything my colleagues say, and we do have people on our team not named David.
We try to find Davids as much as we can.
But I would say that the and this kind of gets to the blueprint. The models for what the question is asking don't exist. There are a lot of people who have spent a lot of time building easy models to buy, Class B buildings and turn them into Class A buildings and make money, and that's all fine. The models, the way you really build wealth is by owning stuff, not by getting paid a wage. And whether it's owning your company or owning property, if you look at Black ownership versus white ownership in the country, that's a massive part of the wealth divide you have. So for example, in housing, the way you really are able to build wealth is by helping people go from renters to owners. And so, you know, there are people like at this seminar we had, there's a guy in Philadelphia named Brian Murray of Shift Capital who's working with this idea called a neighborhood trust, where essentially, you know, the owner of the property would be a trust that is, instead of paying rent to a landlord, you as a renter would pay the same rent per month that you're currently paying as a poor Philadelphia citizen or Richmond citizen or whatever. You'd pay that money into the trust, and after a 10+ year period, the trust would buy the property from investors, and you'd transition from a renter to, it's like a rent to own or a lease to own model. We're currently looking at a Habitat for Humanity development that's trying to build owner-occupied homes, and maybe this neighborhood trust model makes sense. So these things, you know, investing in apartments in a growing part of a city, like the models are there, and we can, you know, maybe do that off the shelf and do that more thoughtfully, and that's a good start. But the stuff that's truly transformative, you know, we're in the top half of the first inning, but we're very excited about workshopping these. That's
a question I'm very intrigued by. Fellow Texan Brene Brown has been quoted as saying recently that the system, people keep saying the system isn't working right. And it's like, no, the system is working exactly the way it was created to work. And how are you changing the system? What is Blueprint doing? What are y'all doing in San Antonio? How do you think about how are we changing the system? And how can you help us talk to for those of us who are coming from the faith side of this, how can we talk about this in terms of powers and principalities? How do we address this system that continues to create the land grabs and to create these vacuums where we don't find our way toward equity, we find our way toward disequity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rosalie. The part of the beginning part of it is having conversations, right? Having these type of conversations, because, you know, I think a lot of times we don't know what we're looking for, right? So as we get educated kind of on what the statistics are, like if we can frame the problem, people will know what to do. So if you don't know what's causing the inequities and you don't know, you know, what they are, it's hard to fight against them. So I think part of it is just kind of getting educated on, you know, what's happening in your community and where those dividing lines are. And then, you know, then trying to figure out, okay, so as Blueprint or even as Admiral Capital, we're so small that we're not changing anything. We're trying to work within the system. We're trying to create opportunity and benefit for the communities within the system. We you know, the opportunity zone legislation was the change, you know, and we're trying to respond to that minute change that, you know, and you see it legislatively. When people do it legislatively, there are going to be a lot of people that take advantage of it in the wrong way. It's going to be, you know, it doesn't always have its intended effect. Sometimes, you know, the wrong people end up benefiting from it. So legislation can be slow and painfully, you know, it can go wrong sometimes. But you know, I love the intent behind opportunity zones, but you know, who knows what the actual, you know, result of it is going to be. But it comes from us getting educated about our communities, having these type of discussions, and then fighting for what we need in those communities. And so I think a lot of it is just the awareness of, okay, there's this, you know, particularly I'm talking to pastors now, and you know, people who, you know, you're people of faith. You got to know your communities, right? You've got to know who the people of need are in those communities, right? And so if you want to be involved on an economic level, which clearly this is, you know, this is a talk about economics, get out there and see where the money's going. You know, get out there and see the communities. What is the layout? And why are certain communities always excluded, right? And so, you know, then we can start to fight for change. Then we know kind of where the lines are drawn and why all the criminals come from that neighborhood, or why all of the bad guys look like this, or, you know, why are we hearing the same stories from the media all the time? Because this, you know, we're locked into these kind of ways about our city. So a lot of it, I think, is having these type of conversations, getting aware of what's the disparity out there. What is the problem? Well, the problem is a lot of people are locked across on the other side of the line. How do we help that? Well, let's get involved. Let's go find out what their frustrations are. How can we support those businesses? How can we grow those communities and begin to break some of those imaginary economic barriers that our community has created?
Yeah, and I mean, the biggest change that I think we're on the investment side, it's consumer demand. You know, as an investment firm, our customers are LPs, are the people investing in us, and every firm, you know, has people investing. It's the money behind the firm, and so as the preferences of that money change, the investment practices will change, and that's, I mean, what's been called for from, you know, shareholder activism in the public markets to, you know, social responsibility bonds and green bonds and all these things. I mean, that's what is going to change. And I think what Blueprint and, I mean, many other impact investment firms are trying to do is, you know, prove that works and prove that you can prove out that model that's saying that you can be socially thoughtful and socially conscious and also be sustainable. So, I mean, we're creating those data points for people in the future to then reference back saying, you know, they did it. And more capital, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, the money that really drives things can feel comfortable tiptoeing into this space. And it's been happening on the environmental side, which is exciting. But, you know, on the social side, I mean, it's still early days, and we're still proving a point.
Another thing along those lines that I'm curious about, kind of flipping that question, and the bit that I do know about Carver and how you started there in the community and made it about the community. I'm trying to figure out how exactly to ask this question, but what has been the bottom up plan, or how do you engage in that community to help them see, to help your neighbors, to help the city and I know David Jr., you and I talked about UT San Antonio and the president there, how he was getting involved. How has the whole civic organization been a part of what you've been doing in San Antonio?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, for us with Carver, we felt like the place to start was education, right? If you build great schools, that's a foundation for a great community, right? Part of the problem with a lot of these communities is they're food deserts. You know, you move out to a certain area and there's no grocery store anywhere near, there's no medical, there's no, you know, that is why COVID, you know, disproportionately impacted people of color, because they just don't have access to the right healthcare. And so how do you change that in a community? Well, education is one. If we built a great school, which IDEA now we have 98 schools. Wow. And all the ones who are eligible to be evaluated are in the top, you know, 200 schools in the country, or top 1,000 schools in the country, or whatever. I don't know exactly what the statistic is, but they're amongst the top schools in the country. So that is a great foundation for a community. So that's what we tried to do. We went into the east side of San Antonio, which, you know, it was a torn down part of the city, and we built this beautiful campus. We created this high value educational opportunity. And then you start to add the community around that. And that's what's happened over the last 20 years now. You have restaurants, and, you know, all the city blocks around that school now have grown tremendously. Property values have gone up tremendously. And so what happens with all the crime and all the things that used to be, you know, the police used to kind of corral in that area? Well, now they got to move them somewhere else, you know, and so I think you got to think organically. How do we grow a community, right? What are the things that need to be in place for people who are, you know, impoverished or just less fortunate? What do they need to survive? They need fresh food, you know, they need healthcare. They need, you know, how do we build those communities? So I think it's thinking organically about the foundations of great community. What's going to draw someone to this side of town? A phenomenal school. Our school at Carver is one of the top schools in the city, consistently for the last 7 years, one of the top schools in the city. So that is a good foundation. And so we're trying to figure out those foundations and how do we build around them.
Yeah, and I mean, the work that we're doing, you know, we're equity investors. We're not swooping in and deciding anything. Like, well, it's completely in the context of the community. And so, I mean, especially a lot of the developers that we're working with, you know, and talking to here in San Antonio have just been like intimately ingrained in, you know, building what the city is wanted to be, especially in the downtown, back to Julian Castro. And so, I mean, we're not changing, you know, we're not coming up with projects. We're trying to listen and hear and find opportunities and see where we can all mutually create value. So I think most of it is listening and seeing what's happening, what are the dynamics. And I think that's why the local nature, I mean, real estate is local by nature, but that local aspect, it's so important. Like, I'm here in San Antonio, you know, we have people in Austin, we're right down the road from Houston. You know, we're ingrained in this community. And so, and, you know, the consequences will affect us. Like, if we do something, you know, extractive here, it's in our own backyard, you know, and so that has reputational as well, you know, consequences as well. So we're trying to be a true stakeholder in this community, which, you know, is just a different mentality than a firm, you know, based out of San Francisco, where you're just a portfolio, you know, you're a portfolio asset for them.
And one important role, because I know a lot of the people on this call are from the church background. I mentioned a bit the kind of minimum viable product of Blueprint Local, so to speak, is this project that I mentioned in Louisville that I did with my friend Bryce Butler and his firm Access Ventures. And we took $5 million in local capital and we invested in 11 projects and 11 properties, housing and commercial, 7 businesses. 5 years later, that portfolio is about doubled in value, and there are 300 new jobs in this very poor African-American neighborhood that didn't exist 5 years ago. We anchored it around this street corner in Shelby Park, but Bryce was formerly a pastor at the church that's on that street corner. And before we did this investing, he had spent 5 years as a pastor in this church doing ministry in the neighborhood. And, you know, I just as business people don't always think about values, I think church people don't always think about money, but you as a church are an integral part of the economy that your community is in. And without the engagement of that church in Louisville, this investment project would have been impossible. And it's been really amazing. A ministry that came out of the church that took women who worked in sex trafficking and found them living wage jobs, opened a bakery that's a commercial tenant in the building that's now kind of a community gathering spot. And so there are things that you do and things that you know in your church community, and if you don't think you are a business person, engaging economically is just so important.
Yeah, I mean, and also the church owns a lot of land. I mean, there are real benefits, you know, that you have to offer. I mean, many benefits. And so thinking about, like, you know, there are public-private partnerships, but could there be, you know, partnerships between the private sector and religious institutions to really find mutually beneficial? You know, there's an effort here led by Sarah Woolsey in San Antonio called Good Acres. And I mean, that's what's trying to work with church leaders to think about, you know, how do we leverage our assets in multiple ways and trying to bridge that gap. So I think that a lot of that conversation's happening. It's just thinking a little bit more proactively and really knowing kind of what do you have to offer in some of these relationships.
Yeah, one thing that I have heard Bryce talk about in the past was when and I won't get the story exactly right. If Bryce, if you're listening, forgive me, but that a factory that many of the people in their congregation worked in closed, and they bought it. They said, you know, we're going to figure out what we can do in this place. And I think that's where the bakery is now, is that they, in that building. But how to see as a congregation, to see your neighborhood holistically and to not just go, oh, what a shame that factory closed. So what can we do about that?
Yeah, you know, I think you all have really brought a really great like some really great points to this key. I've thought about, like, I've talked to a lot of parents, a lot of poor parents, a lot of wealthy parents. I've yet to met one parent that says, I don't care about my kids' education. The difference is that some parents could say, hey, I could choose a zip code that has a quality education. And so that's the challenge I think that we live in. I think one of the biggest justice issues that we have in our country right now is that your zip code can determine your quality education. And we don't even think about it as a problem, you know. And so I'm really thankful that y'all are addressing that issue. And just a closing thought, as we wrap this up, is can you just talk to pastors, faith leaders? How can we either create and create opportunities and spaces for like the new Ross Bairds to come, or the new Dave Robertson Juniors, or seniors, to cultivate those, because I think they're in our congregation, and if you're somebody with wealth and capital right now, and you're a person of faith, can you speak to them, and say how can you begin to do some repairing of the breach of the streets that have been laid broken and dormant for centuries, for decades and or centuries. So you could talk to one. Either could talk to the pastors, or you can talk to the folks with capital, or you can talk to both if you'd like to.
You mean the pastors aren't the ones with the capital?
Depends on which pastor.
Not this one.
Okay, I'll start it a little bit, but I think part of the issue here in San Antonio, and with my three sons, all three of them, I want, obviously wanted them to go to great schools, but as they were kind of going through high school, their very first thought, as David Jr. said, was, as soon as we graduate, we're leaving. That was kind of, to me, that was a problem. Like, we've got a great city here in San Antonio. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Why is there not going to be an opportunity for my three sons here in San Antonio?
Right.
And how do we create that opportunity to say, okay, son, I want you to stay here in San Antonio. I want you to help build this city. I want you to help grow the city. And so I do think that, we need to recognize those trends. Where are the kids in our churches going? What are they doing when they graduate? The most talented kids we have, what are they doing? Are they staying in town? Are they leaving to go to another town? Is there enough opportunity within the church for them to grow? There's a lot of questions I think we need to really answer for ourselves. And, for David Jr. now, after only, a handful of years, he went up to New York. He worked in the city for a few years, for 4 or 5 years. And now he's back here in San Antonio. To me, that's the most thrilling thing. There's opportunity in San Antonio for a young Black entrepreneur. Like, wow, this is great. I hope we can create this for many people, the opportunity to come and work here in San Antonio and grow a business and be successful. So I think that's kind of how we need to think about our communities a little bit. Like, is our talent seeping out? Are our best, people in our congregation, where are they going? What are they doing? Are they working with the church, or do they go run out and work with people in the community because the church doesn't have an avenue to engage them in the community? So if we have to think outside the box a little bit to say, we've got to figure out ways to be more practically valuable to our congregation, right? What are we adding to their lives? How are we bringing back the talented people from our congregation to re-engage, not just with the congregation, but with the community? So I think those are things we need to answer those questions, because I didn't have good answers for those questions when my kids were in high school. I was afraid they were going to leave, and they all did, except for him. He stayed in Texas. The other two, one went to Notre Dame and one went to Duke. Great, they're great schools, but you know what? There's great schools here in Texas. So I think that's one area we can do a better job is how do we join in creating those opportunities? Now, if a church gets involved in the deal and says we have land, and how do we become a partner in using this land and growing, then maybe there's some opportunity for some finance people to really get involved with the church and to help maintain the church's interest. So there's a lot of ways I think we can think about this differently, but the church needs to be a part of the solution.
That's good.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. Growing up here, like he said, I really didn't see. I didn't see many young people like me, young ambitious people like me, who looked like me, at all. And so, I think a lot of even more on the subconscious side is like, I got to go somewhere else, for there to be opportunity. I just didn't see it. It was here without a doubt, but I just didn't see it. And so my first instinct was to go. So I think I mean, people in your lives, connect them with opportunity, take them to places and expand their horizons locally and show them, paint a different story of the city for them. And I think, I mean, a lot of kids growing up here think it's like sleepy old San Antonio. It's like, there's a ton of stuff happening here. So you gotta actively, proactively put them out in the community and show them what's happening. And it'll change how they think about the city. And they'll be, you know, they'll see themselves and they'll see a future for themselves in the city in an entirely different way.
Great. And Ross, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I would say that the phrase that David said at the beginning about two pocket, one pocket, that comes from a story. When I started Village Capital, there was a guy who went to my church. He's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Atlanta. And I pitched him on investing in Village Capital, this impact investment fund. And he, very philanthropic guy. He's like, young man, interesting idea, but I got two pockets. You know, with one pocket, I make as much money as I can. With the other pocket, you know, my wife and I, we try and give it all away. And he goes, boy, which pocket are you asking me for? He didn't fund me out of either pocket. That was not that was a fundraising meeting. But it did give me this phrase of, you know, there's the values pocket and the money-making pocket, and business could use a lot more of the values pocket. But I do think the church could interact more with the economy because it's a needed voice. So for example, at my church in Atlanta, I talked to my pastor and we used a portion of the church. It was a church plant in South Atlanta in a neighborhood where there was pretty high unemployment. It was 2010 in the height of the recession. We used a portion of the church's mission budget for a microloan fund for businesses in the neighborhood. And we had this like working group of local business owners. Like there was a woman who ran a mortuary and she needed $500 to buy wood to make new coffins. And so it was kind of a revolving loan fund that the church administered. And I remember the church originally said, this is crazy. Why are we doing, 0% interest loans to people in our neighborhood? But then they heard these stories of these people who lived in the neighborhood and came and worshiped with us. And here's what the $500 did. And people got it. And, the church became a community lender in this community that didn't have a bank. And that's the same thing with David. That pastor at church is actually now in Austin, Texas. And this church owns a bunch of land, and they actually kind of informed by that experience that we had, they have this kind of church task force on what do we do with this land to serve the community and not just build, another thing that's nice to look at, but doesn't serve the broader community. So thinking of the people and the resources you have, I mean, were it not for a youth pastor that took a bunch of privileged white kids in Atlanta and got them out of their bubble, I wouldn't be here having this conversation. And thinking about what you have, what you can do, the privilege or the lack of power. I mean, everyone's got power in some ways, but if you have privilege and money and power, you have a lot of responsibility. Thinking about that within your church community can be transformative, but you got to be a one pocket thinker, I would say, to use that analogy.
That's good.
Yeah, my favorite thing on the one pocket is just taking it back to the question when they asked Jesus, what do we give to Caesar and what do we give to God? And my understanding of what happened there was that Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar and the things that are to God, the things that are God's, with the knowledge that the Jewish tradition, the Jewish law was it's all God's. So there aren't two pockets. There's just one pocket. It's all God's pocket, and how we are paying attention to God's pocket.
That's tricky.
Yeah.
Jesus was being tricky, huh?
Yeah.
I see.
Jesus, he was a trickster. There's no question about it. And one of the things that's really frustrating to me in the work I'm trying to do is that Jesus was such a trickster, and we have these bland, black and white tools called the economy to deal with it. And we've got to learn how to be tricksters too. We've got to learn how to use our reputations and our humor and all that we've got to really encounter some of these challenges, because we're not going to get it just by saying, oh, here's this, do it. That's not going to work. We're going to have to figure
Well, I agree with that. I think it's a good point. I think Jesus cut through the garbage, right? Like you have to be able to sort. This is discernment. God gives you discernment so you can cut through all the unnecessary stuff. If you're going to deal with finances, You can't get caught up in all the stuff everyone else gets caught up in. You have to have discernment and be able to cut through all the foolishness and say, you know, how do we use this in a way that honors the Lord? And that can be hard. You know, when we start making decisions for money's sake, that's when we're starting to get off track.
Yeah, last week we had a wonderful theologian and economist, a woman who has her PhD in both theology and economy from Cambridge, and she's written a book called Buying God. And she was talking to us about taking her bank statement or her credit card bill and going through each one with a green, orange, and red marker and highlighting every single transaction on her credit card bill, saying this one was for God, this one was for me, this one was a mistake, and trying to get to where she sees more and more of her values in every penny that she spends. And I hear that from what David Jr. was saying about the endowment. You know, how is it not just, you know, how are we seeing our values in every piece of what we do, not just how we invest it in our community, but how we invest the corpus as well. So it's been a real joy to talk with y'all, and hope that we can have you back when we are going to come to San Antonio. There's no doubt about it. We will be there as soon as COVID will let us have an event, and we're going to work to make sure that both of you are in town when we do that, because we really want to meet you face to face and to continue this conversation. Until then, we are just a few days away from launching a network called Mighty Networks, where the conversations about this can be happening online. And like I said, we're going to be announcing in a day or two the times and dates for a conversation about COVID, Christian entrepreneurs who are working in COVID and some of the pivots that they have made. One of whom we're hoping to get to join us has a distillery in Austin. Chris Seal, who is working, has turned his distillery into to making hand sanitizer. So that's going to be kind of a fun conversation. And then the other conversation that we're trying to get scheduled is about reparations and Jubilee and how they fit together, and how we as people of faith can pay attention to all of the ways that we can start to change the system. So thank you all for joining us, and look for an email from us telling you what's next. And thank you, David and Ross, so much for joining us.
One final thing. I've tried to answer some questions, but I can't get to everyone's question. I've left a contact form in there, so just drop us a line. It goes directly to David Jr.'s inbox.
Thanks, Ross.
And he shares it all with me. So David Jr. And I will see all your questions. You know, there are some things that around future funds and things we're thinking that we can't talk about to a public audience because of SEC regulations, but we can talk one-on-one. And there are other things that we've got, you know, other articles and resources. So drop us a line. If I'm not answering your question, it's we either didn't have time or the SEC would say I can't actually answer it, but we can answer it one-on-one.
Yeah.
So,
there are about 20 questions in there we didn't get to. Thank you all for the questions, and join us again. We'll see you soon.
God bless.
Yep.